Story number 1. The Thing Under the Ice. I shouldn't have gone ice fishing alone that night. The storm had started rolling in, and the temperature had dropped so fast, my breath turned thick and heavy, but I had been stubborn. The guys had bailed, claiming the weather was too dangerous, but I was determined. A few hours on the frozen lake, one big catch, and I'd be back by midnight. That was the plan. I drilled a hole through the thick sheet of ice, the blade of my auger grinding against something harder than usual. It took longer than expected, but eventually the ice cracked, and a pool of inky black water appeared. The silence out there was suffocating. Just me, my fishing rod, and the eerie stillness of the frozen lake. No wind, no birds, no distant howls of wolves. Just cold, thick silence pressing in from all sides. I sat there for nearly an hour, watching the thin fishing line disappear into the dark water. The wind had picked up, howling across the barren expanse, and I started to regret staying out so late. I checked my watch, 11:23 p.m., maybe another 15 minutes, I thought, and then something yanked my line, hard. I nearly lost my grip as the rod bent violently. My heart pounded as I steadied myself, the line dragging deeper. Whatever was hooked on the other end was strong, too strong. The ice creaked beneath me as I fought to pull it up, the tension in my arms turning into pure panic. It wasn't a fish. It felt heavier. And then the line snapped. I fell backward, gasping. My breath came out in sharp clouds of vapor, my pulse thudding in my ears. The hole in the ice rippled unnaturally, as if something beneath the surface was shifting, moving. I crawled forward, peering into the black water, and that's when I saw it. A hand, not a fish, not a log, a human hand, pale and bloated, reaching up from the depths. I scrambled back, my boots sliding on the ice. My mind raced. Maybe it was a corpse, some poor soul who had fallen through weeks ago. But then it moved. The fingers twitched, curling slightly, as if stretching for something for me. My breath hitched. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. I could only watch in horror as the hand retreated into the blackness, disappearing without a trace. Silence. And then knocking. A slow, deliberate knocking from beneath the ice. 3 knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more. I scrambled to my feet, my entire body trembling. The ice beneath me groaned as if something was shifting below. I turned, gripping my gear. But the moment I moved, it knocked again, louder this time. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. My boots pounded against the ice, slipping with every step. The wind screamed around me, the snow stinging my face. But all I could hear was the knocking. Faster now, harder. And then the ice cracked. It split open with a deafening roar, sending jagged lines racing across the lake. I barely managed to stop myself from falling in, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My truck was parked at the edge of the lake, just a few hundred feet away. I just had to make it there. I forced my legs to move, ignoring the way the ice beneath me pulsed as if something beneath it was breathing. I reached my truck and fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking too much to get the door open. I risked a glance back at the lake. The hole where I had been fishing had grown. The water churned, rippling outward, and then it surfaced. At first I thought it was a person, a head, pushing up through the broken ice. But then I saw the eyes, pale, milky, locked onto me with an unnatural intensity. The face was wrong, too stretched. The mouth too wide. The hands that gripped the ice were long, unnatural. It wasn't trying to climb out. It was watching me. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, locking it in one frantic motion. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. But then, the worst part happened. The truck wouldn't start. I turned the key again, and again. The engine groaned but refused to turn over, and then tap, tap, tap. I froze. The knocking. Not from beneath the ice this time, from my window. I turned my head, heart hammering so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. The window was fogged from my breath, but I could still see it. A hand, pressed against the glass, fingers too long, skin too pale. Slowly, the condensation cleared, revealing its face. That horrible, stretched face. It was grinning. I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, turning the key so hard I thought it would break. The engine roared to life. My tires spun against the ice before finally catching. I didn't look back as I sped away, my hands gripping the wheel with white-knuckled terror. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, an hour away. I sat in the parking lot of a gas station, trying to convince myself it hadn't been real, that my mind had played tricks on me. But then I glanced at my window. There, smeared across the fogged glass, a handprint, fingers too long, too unnatural, and a single word traced into the condensation. Knock. I never went back to that lake. I never fished alone again. And to this day, I never, ever ignore a knocking sound in the night, because I know now. Sometimes something knocks back. Story number 2, the cabin that wasn't there. The storm came out of nowhere. 1 minute, the night was calm, the sky a vast black emptiness above the snow-covered trail. The next, the wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal, thick flurries of snow whipping against my face, blinding me. I couldn't see the path anymore. I couldn't see anything, just white, endless white. I wasn't supposed to be out this late. The hike had taken longer than expected, and by the time I realized I should turn back, the snowfall had swallowed my footprints. My phone was useless. No signal. Battery draining faster than it should. The cold clawed at my skin, seeping through my layers, biting at my fingers, even through my gloves. If I didn't find shelter soon, I wouldn't make it through the night. Then, as if summoned from the void, I saw it. A cabin. The structure stood between the trees, barely visible through the blizzard. A warm, golden glow flickered through the windows. A thin wisp of smoke curling from the chimney. Relief crashed over me like a wave. I wasn't alone out here. Someone lived here. Someone who could help. I stumbled toward the cabin, legs numb, breath ragged. My boots crunched over fresh snow as I approached the porch. The door was solid wood, old but sturdy. I hesitated, lifting my fist to knock, but something made me stop. The door was already open, just a crack. Warm air leaked from the gap, carrying the scent of burning wood and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was simple. Wooden walls, a fireplace crackling with life, a small table set for one. A pot simmered on the stove, releasing a faint trail of steam. It felt untouched, like someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. Hello? My voice felt too small for the space, too uncertain. No answer. I should have questioned it more. The fact that in the middle of nowhere a cabin stood waiting, warm and ready as if it had been expecting me, but I was too cold, too exhausted to care. I shut the door behind me, pulled off my gloves, and let the fire thaw the numbness in my hands. That's when I noticed them. The footprints, not mine. They led from the front door to the fireplace and stopped. Just stopped. No return prints, no indication that someone had left. I turned, scanning the room. The air had changed. The warmth that had felt comforting now pressed in too thickly, the silence stretching into something unnatural. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, a deep sinking sensation in my stomach. I wasn't alone. Slowly I moved toward the table. The single plate of food was still warm, steam rising off of it in lazy tendrils. I touched the chair. It was warm too, as if someone had just been sitting there. Then I heard it, a soft creak from the floorboards above me. I looked up. The cabin had a loft, a shadowy space just above where I stood. The wooden railing blocked most of the view, but I could make out the edge of a bed. The blankets rumpled. Another creak, slow, deliberate. I wasn't sure if I was breathing anymore. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stepped back toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to leave. And then the whisper came, right behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around so fast, I nearly tripped over the chair, but no one was there. The air behind me was empty, yet I could still feel it. The presence, the weight of unseen eyes crawling over me. The fire flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the walls. The warmth in the room became suffocating, pressing against my skin like something alive. I bolted for the door, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles turned white. It wouldn't open. I twisted the knob, yanked at it, with every ounce of strength I had, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the door had fused into the frame, trapping me inside. My breath came fast, ragged. Then, footsteps, not upstairs this time, right behind me. I turned, slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack under the pressure. There was no one there, but the chair was pulled out now, the one at the table, and the plate, empty. I didn't hear chewing. I didn't hear movement. But whatever had been sitting there had finished its meal. The whisper came again, so close it felt like it was inside my head. "You shouldn't have come." The room shifted. The walls stretched taller. The fireplace twisted like a living thing. The shadows deepened into something thick, almost solid. The warmth turned to rot, the scent of burning wood replaced by something old and damp. The cabin was changing. I banged against the door, panic taking over. I didn't care if I broke the damn thing down. I had to get out. I slammed my shoulder into it once, twice, and then, suddenly, it flew open. I stumbled outside, gasping for air. The storm had stopped. The world outside was eerily still. The snow beneath my feet was untouched. No footprints, no signs that I had ever walked toward the cabin at all. I turned back, expecting to see the wooden structure standing ominously against the trees. But there was nothing there. The cabin was gone, just an empty clearing. My breath fogged in the air as I took a slow step backward, then another. My head spun. I had been inside. I had touched the chair, felt the fire, heard the whispers, but the cabin had never been there. Then, just as I turned to leave, I saw them. Footprints, leading away from where the cabin should have been, not mine, fresh, leading directly toward me. I ran. I didn't stop until I saw my truck, until I was inside, until the engine roared to life, and I was speeding away from that place. I never told anyone what happened. I never went back. But sometimes, on winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the world is silent, I still hear it. The whisper, "You shouldn't have come." Story number 3. The Screaming Snowman. We built the snowman as a joke, just something to pass the time while the storm raged around our cabin. It wasn't even a good one. Lopsided, too thin in the middle, with a crooked grin made from sticks we found nearby. But it stood tall, staring back at us through the frosted window as we laughed, warmed by the fire inside. It was supposed to be fun, until it screamed. At first, I thought it was the wind. The storm had picked up, howling through the trees, shaking the roof. But this sound was different, higher, sharper, human. It sliced through the night like a knife, long and agonizing. I felt it in my bones. We fell silent, all three of us, me, Eric, and Daniel, staring at each other with wide eyes. No one moved. The fire crackled. The wind moaned. Then, another scream, even louder, echoing across the frozen lake outside. Eric swallowed hard. Was that? Daniel shook his head, standing slowly. Probably an animal. But we all knew better. I stood, heart pounding, and pulled back the curtain. The snowman was still there, standing just outside the cabin, its black stone eyes fixed on the window. Its grin seemed wider. The twigs we'd used for its mouth had shifted, curling at the ends like something stretching, something moving. The wind had knocked some of the snow from its head, revealing something dark beneath. Not snow, not ice, something else. I stepped away from the window, my breath coming fast. We should knock it over. Daniel snorted. It's just a snowman. But I could see it in his face. He was trying to convince himself more than me. The third scream was right outside, loud, shattering, and it came from the snowman. The sound paralyzed me. I felt it wrap around my skull, piercing, raw. Eric stumbled backward, knocking over his chair, his hands over his ears. Daniel cursed under his breath. I thought. The scream didn't stop. It stretched into something unnatural, a long, guttural wail that made my vision blur. The window rattled. The glasses on the table shaking. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. Then, silence. The air felt thick, too still, as if the world had paused. No wind, no fire crackling, just an unbearable pressing quiet. Then, a knock. Slow, deliberate, 3 times, on the window. None of us spoke. None of us breathed. Then came the whisper. Let me in. I grabbed Eric's arm, yanking him back as he inched toward the window. Daniel was frozen, his knuckles white against the table's edge. Another knock. The whisper came again, fainter, curling around the room like smoke. Let me in. I forced myself to look. The snowman was closer, right up against the cabin now, its jagged grin pressed against the glass, its twig arms raised, knocking. I felt sick. Eric backed away, shaking his head. That wasn't like that before. Daniel grabbed the poker from the fireplace, gripping it so tight his knuckles went pale. We knock it down. Now. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say we should stay inside, ignore it, pretend it didn't exist. But I couldn't, because I could still hear the whisper. And it was inside the cabin now. Daniel moved first. He threw open the door, stepping out into the cold, with the poker raised. The storm had calmed, snow falling in soft, thick flakes. Everything was too quiet, too empty. The moment he stepped onto the porch, the whisper stopped. The snowman stood still. I followed him hesitantly, my boots crunching over fresh snow. Eric stayed in the doorway, his breath visible in the freezing air. Daniel lifted the poker and swung. The metal smashed against the snowman's head, sending chunks of ice flying. He hit it again, harder this time, cursing under his breath. Just snow, he muttered. It's just snow. But then something cracked. Not like ice, not like snow breaking apart, like bone. Daniel froze. The snowman's grin hadn't changed, but something inside it had shifted. The wind picked up again, swirling around us, the cold suddenly unbearable. Then, movement. The snowman twitched. I saw it, just the slightest shift in its posture, a tilt of its head, but it moved. Daniel took a step back. Did you see? Then the scream came again, right in our faces. It burst from inside the snowman, ripping through the night like a wounded animal. Too loud, too close. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. I felt it inside my skull, like nails dragging across my brain. Daniel stumbled backward, falling into the snow. The snowman collapsed, not like snow falling apart, but like something inside it broke, like a body crumbling. Beneath the melting snow, I saw something black, something twisted. Fingers tangled in the ice. A mouth stretched too wide. Then it was gone. The whisper returned, curling through the trees, wrapping around us. You shouldn't have done that. The snow beneath Daniel sank. I grabbed his arm, yanking him up just as the ground collapsed. A hole, deep and dark, opening up where the snowman had stood. It swallowed the broken remains, dragging them down into the earth. We ran. Eric slammed the door shut behind us, locking it, bolting it, anything to keep whatever that was outside. The fire had nearly gone out. Our breath came fast, ragged. No one spoke. No one could. We waited. Minutes. Hours. Nothing happened. The storm returned, howling through the trees, covering any sign of what had happened. By morning, the clearing where the snowman had stood was untouched. No footprints, no broken pieces of ice. Just smooth, white snow. Daniel refused to talk about it. Eric didn't say a word. But that night, just before we went to sleep, I heard it. Software distant. A whisper. Let me in. Story number 4. Trapped in yesterday. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed against your ears, thick and unnatural, like the world itself had stopped moving. No wind against the cabin walls, no birds, no distant cracking of ice on the lake, just heavy, suffocating stillness. I sat up in my sleeping bag, blinking at the dim light filtering through the frosted window. Something felt wrong. I didn't know what. Not yet. But the air had that strange weight to it, like the calm before a storm. I glanced over at my phone, 7:42 a.m., battery at 83%. Strange, considering I had left it at 20% before sleeping. Brushing off the unease, I slipped into my boots and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath my feet as I walked toward the frozen lake, the same path I had taken the day before. But something made me pause. My footprints were gone. It had snowed last night, I told myself. That's all. The fresh layer had covered them up. But as I looked around, I realized something else. The snow wasn't just undisturbed. It was exactly as it had been yesterday. The same small mountains, the same icicles hanging from the roof. I turned, my stomach tightening. There, in the distance, stood the same broken tree I had passed yesterday morning, its jagged branches reaching toward the sky. And at my feet, half buried in the snow, was the fishing rod I had left exactly where I had dropped it. A chill crawled up my spine, colder than the winter air. I had picked it up yesterday. I had taken it back inside. A breath hitched in my throat. I hurried back to the cabin, flinging open the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. My bag was where I had left it. my boots lying neatly against the wall. But then I saw the note, the same note I had written yesterday, still on the table, unmoved, unread. But I had taken it. I had crumpled it, stuffed it into my pocket before heading out. I fumbled in my jacket. My pockets were empty. I grabbed my phone again. 7:42 a.m. The same time, the same battery percentage. Something was very, very wrong. I burst out of the cabin, my breath coming in fast clouds of white, my boots sinking into the snow as I turned in circles, searching for something, anything that had changed. Nothing had. The wind had stopped. The sky had the same overcast gray as yesterday morning. The trees stood still, frozen in time. I pulled my phone from my pocket again. 7:42 a.m. The seconds weren't moving. My head pounded. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I saw it. The footprints. At first, relief hit me like a wave. My footprints. There, in the snow. I wasn't imagining things. But as I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't mine. They were identical to mine. Same size, same pattern. The left one dragging slightly, just like mine did when I was tired. But they weren't leading from the cabin. They were leading to it. Panic clawed its way up my throat. I followed them step by step, back toward the cabin, my body moving against every instinct screaming at me to run. The prints stopped at the doorstep, right where I had walked out, like something had been here before me. A shadow passed across the window. I froze. Someone was inside. I had left the door open. I knew I had. But now it was closed. Slowly, I reached for the handle. My fingers were shaking. The air inside was thick, suffocating, but nothing looked different. Same table, same sleeping bag, same. The mirror. I had barely glanced at it before, a small old thing hanging near the fireplace. But now, something was wrong. I wasn't in it. I stepped closer. The reflection showed the room exactly as it was. The table, the chair, the half-empty water bottle on the counter, but not me. A sharp breath left my lungs. My legs refused to move. The silence was heavier now, pressing into my skull. I lifted a shaking hand toward the mirror. Nothing. Just empty space where I should have been. Then, a whisper. Software. Too close. You came back. A shadow moved behind me. I spun, heart slamming against my ribs. But there was nothing there. The door was still closed. The room was still empty. But the whisper hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside my head. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled at the latch, breath hitching. But as I threw it open, my body locked up. The outside world had reset. The footprints I had followed to the cabin, gone. The snow, smooth, untouched. The trees stood exactly as they had before. And then I saw them, more footprints, leading from the tree line, coming toward me. But this time, they weren't mine. They were bigger, closer, and then a voice. Not a whisper this time, not inside my head, right behind me. Fabre. I didn't turn around. I ran. I ran so fast my boots barely touched the ground. I didn't stop to check my phone. I didn't stop to look at the cabin. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed for me to stop. But the footsteps behind me never faded. They followed, matching my speed, never stopping. The road appeared ahead, barely visible through the haze of snow. My truck was there, engine still covered in frost. I yanked open the door, my frozen fingers fumbling with the keys. The moment I turned the ignition, I dared to look back. The cabin was gone. The forest stood still, untouched. No footprints, no path leading to where I'd been, no sign of the nightmare I had just escaped. But just before I sped away, I glanced at my phone one last time. The screen flickered. The time finally changed. 7:43 a.m. And then the battery drained to zero. The last thing I saw before the screen went black was a single notification. One new message. See you tomorrow. Story number 5. The snow angel that moved. We had been at the cabin for 3 days when my little cousin, Lily, made the snow angel. It was nothing unusual, just a 6-year-old having fun in the fresh snowfall. She giggled as she spread her arms and legs, shaping the figure beneath her before hopping up and admiring her work. "Look," she grinned, pointing proudly at the imprint. I laughed, ruffling her hair. "Perfect." That was before it moved. The night was cold, bitterly so. The fire crackled in the cabin's hearth while the wind rattled against the windows. The others were asleep, but I couldn't. Something felt off, a kind of quiet that didn't belong in the middle of the woods. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside for some fresh air. And then I saw it. The snow angel was different. At first, I thought the wind had shifted it slightly, making the shape more distorted. But the more I stared, the more I realized. It hadn't just changed. It had moved. It wasn't where Lily had made it. It had shifted 2 feet closer to the cabin. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I scanned the ground for footprints, for any sign that someone or something had dragged themselves through the snow. Nothing. The angel was just there. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and convinced myself I was seeing things. Maybe I had remembered wrong. Maybe the snow had settled in an odd way. Maybe. The next morning, Lily squealed with delight. "Look, my angel moved." She was standing by the window, pointing outside. My stomach twisted. I walked over, dreading what I'd see. It had moved again. Closer. Lily ran out the door before I could stop her, hopping excitedly toward the imprint. I followed quickly, my boots crunching against the frozen ground. "Lily, wait." She stopped right at the edge, staring down at it with wide eyes. "It's different," she whispered. She was right. The shape had changed. The arms that had been stretched out before were now bent, like elbows digging into the snow. The legs, too, had shifted slightly, bent at the knees, as if something had tried to push itself up. I grabbed Lily's hand. "Inside. Now." She pouted, but I wasn't playing around. I locked the door behind us, pulled the curtains closed, and tried to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. That night, I barely slept. Every hour, I found myself glancing out the window, expecting, no, dreading, to see it again. But the snowstorm had picked up, and visibility was near zero. I told myself it was fine. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a scraping sound, slow, deliberate, like something heavy dragging across the frozen ground. I held my breath. It was right outside the cabin. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the window, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. With shaking fingers, I peeled back the curtain. The snow angel was standing, no longer an imprint in the snow, but a shape, a figure carved into the ice itself. It stood there frozen and unmoving, its hollow, snow-packed head tilted toward the cabin, toward me, and there were others, a dozen more, scattered in the clearing, all facing the cabin, all standing, all watching. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to wake everyone up, to run, then knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the door. My knees nearly gave out. I turned, staring at the wooden entrance, my pulse thundering in my skull. Another knock. I backed away, pressing myself against the wall, willing the sound to be in my head. Then something scratched against the door. Not a knock this time, a slow, dragging scrape, like fingers on wood. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with something wrong. Then, from outside, a whisper, not words, just breathe, slow, cold, right on the other side of the door. I closed my eyes, praying, waiting, counting the seconds in my head. Then, silence. I don't know how long I stood there before I moved, before I forced myself to peer through the peephole. The snow was untouched. The figures were gone. The angel, the first one, the one Lily had made, was back to normal, just a simple imprint in the snow, as if nothing had happened at all. But I know what I saw. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. We're leaving. Lily whined, but she didn't argue when she saw the look in my eyes. We packed up quickly, shoving everything into the car. I barely looked outside, barely breathed until we were on the road, speeding away from that God-forsaken place. But just before we turned the final bend, Lily let out a gasp. Look, I didn't want to, but I did, and I wish I hadn't. In the clearing, barely visible through the trees, stood a new snow angel. Not lying in the snow this time, standing, watching us leave. Story number 6, The Shadow. In the blizzard. The blizzard swallowed the world whole. The snow had started light that morning, a soft dusting over the frozen lake. But by nightfall, it had turned violent. Wind howled through the trees, thick waves of white crashing against the cabin, burying the world in an endless, shifting fog. The power had gone out hours ago. The only light came from the flickering fireplace, casting trembling shadows against the wooden walls. I was alone. I had come up to the cabin for a few days of peace, away from the noise of the city. Just me, the woods, and the silence. But now, that silence felt suffocating. The storm had turned the familiar landscape into something alien. I could barely see past the window, just swirling snow and darkness stretching endlessly. Then, something moved. A shadow. It cut through the storm, shifting against the white haze outside. I froze. It was impossible to tell what it was. Just a dark smudge against the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the wind, but then it moved again, closer. I stepped back from the window, my pulse hammering in my throat. No one should be out here. The nearest cabin was miles away. Even if someone had gotten lost, they wouldn't have made it through the storm. No tracks, no signs of a person struggling against the wind. But the shadow was still there, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. A gust of wind shook the cabin, rattling the walls. I exhaled shakily, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A trick of the light, a branch shifting in the storm, something normal. Then the knocking started. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. I swallowed hard, my body going rigid. The door was locked. The windows were closed. But the sound hadn't come from there. It had come from the back wall. I turned slowly, dread curling in my stomach. The knocks came again. 3 sharp raps against the wooden boards. The back wall of the cabin faced the woods. There was no porch, no path. Just a drop-off into endless trees. I crept toward the sound. Every nerve in my body screaming for me to stop. The wind howled, shaking the windows. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. Another knock. I pressed my ear against the wooden wall, heart hammering. The storm roared outside. a deafening force of nature, but beneath it, breathing, shallow, ragged, right on the other side of the wall. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair behind me. The fire crackled violently, the shadows stretching, shifting as if they were moving. I grabbed the fireplace poker, my fingers clenching around the cold metal, and then silence. The knocking stopped. The breathing vanished. I stood there for what felt like hours. The storm raging outside, waiting for something, anything to happen. Then the power flickered back on for half a second. And in that half second, just before the cabin was swallowed by darkness again, I saw it, a figure standing inside the cabin, tall, motionless, its face hidden in the flickering light. Then, darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My body refused to move, paralyzed by a terror so deep it rooted me to the floor. The fire burned low, barely illuminating the room. My eyes darted frantically around the shadows. The figure was gone. Had I imagined it? Had the light played tricks on me? My breath came in ragged bursts, the poker trembling in my hands. Then the whisper came. You let me in. It wasn't outside anymore, it was behind me. I spun, swinging the poker wildly, but there was nothing. Just empty air, the shadows stretching across the walls. My pulse pounded in my ears, my hands slick with sweat. Then the knocking started again, not from the back wall this time, from the ceiling, slow, deliberate, like fingers tapping against the wood. I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, my breath ragged. The storm outside was brutal, but I didn't care. I had to get out. Then the lights flickered again, and I saw them, the shadows, no longer outside, no longer just one. Dozens of them, tall, thin figures standing just beyond the firelight, pressed against the walls, the ceiling, the windows, motionless, watching. Then, all at once, they took a step forward. The storm roared as I threw open the door, the wind nearly knocking me off my feet. Snow blinded me, the freezing air stabbing my lungs as I stumbled into the night. I ran, my boots sinking into the snow, my body screaming for warmth. I didn't look back. I could feel them behind me, moving through the blizzard, silent, fast. The trees blurred past. As I sprinted toward my truck, my heart slamming against my ribs, I yanked the door open, my fingers so numb they barely worked. The engine sputtered, struggling against the cold. Then, in the rearview mirror, a face, pale, hollow, too wide, smiling. The truck roared to life. I hit the gas, my tires spinning, kicking up slush and ice as I tore down the snow-covered road. The cabin vanished into the storm, swallowed by the endless white. But the shadows, they followed. I don't know how long I drove. Hours, days, time blurred, my body numb, my mind barely holding on to sanity. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stumbled into a gas station, hands shaking, breath ragged. The attendant looked up, frowning. "You okay, man?" I tried to speak. Nothing came out. "You been out in that storm all night?" He shook his head. "Damn near froze yourself. Where you coming from?" I swallowed, forcing the words out. "Cabin, by the lake." He gave me a strange look. "There ain't no cabin by the lake." I stared at him, my body going cold all over again. "You sure, man?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "That place burned down years ago. Some guy got trapped there during a storm. They never found his body." My pulse slowed. My skin prickled. I turned, glancing toward the window. The storm had passed. The snow had stopped. But in the distance, just beyond the gas station lights, a shadow stood, watching, waiting. Story number 7. The wolves that weren't wolves. The first howl came just after midnight. Low, guttural, stretching long into the frozen air. It carried across the snow-covered trees, weaving through the silence like something ancient, something hungry. I'd never heard a wolf sound like that before. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my breath fogging in the cold air of the cabin. The fire had burned low, barely enough to keep the chill from seeping into my bones. My friend Jake stirred on the cot across from me, rubbing his face groggily. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jake grunted, pulling his blanket over his head. "It's just wolves, man. Go back to sleep." But something about that sound had set my nerves on edge. It hadn't been a normal wolf call. It had been too slow, too deliberate. I got up and moved toward the window, peering out into the dark. The snow was untouched, stretching in smooth mounds beneath the pale glow of the moon. The trees swayed gently in the wind. For a moment, everything was still. Then, another howl. Closer. This time, it wasn't just one. Multiple voices joined in, overlapping, their tones unnatural. And the sound wasn't random. It had a pattern, like speech. A chill crawled down my spine. I turned back toward Jake. "Something's wrong," he groaned, sitting up. "Dude, I swear if this is about..." Then he heard it too. A sound just outside the cabin. Not a howl. A laugh. It was distant, broken, almost like someone mimicking laughter, but wrong. Like a person who had never laughed before trying to copy the sound. Jake's face paled. He swung his legs off the cot. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, inching away from the window. The air in the cabin felt thick, pressing against my chest like something unseen was watching, waiting. The laugh came again, closer this time. Then, scratching, long, slow drags of claws, or something like claws, against the wooden walls. It moved from the back of the cabin to the front door. Jake grabbed the axe we had brought for firewood. His knuckles were white around the handle. "We lock the door?" I nodded slowly, stepping toward it. But then 3 knocks. Software, almost polite. We froze. The laughter outside stopped. The wind had died completely, leaving only thick silence between us and whoever, whatever, was on the other side of the door. Then a voice, a whisper, "Let us in." Jake sucked in a sharp breath. My pulse slammed against my ribs. The voice wasn't human. It tried to be. The words were there, but the tone was wrong, stretched, too deep and too high at the same time, like a chorus of voices speaking through one mouth. I reached for the rifle we had brought for emergencies, my hands slick with sweat. Another knock, harder this time, then scraping. I couldn't breathe. The whisper came again, curling around the edges of the door. "You made a fire. We're so cold." Jake shook his head, stepping back, gripping the axe tighter. Then we heard it. Footsteps, not one pair. Several, moving in a slow, dragging circle around the cabin. I turned to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. And that's when I saw them. Figures, not wolves. Tall, too tall, their limbs elongated, their heads tilting at impossible angles. Their eyes gleamed in the moonlight, reflecting like an animal's, but their mouths too wide, too human. They moved strangely, like they had only just learned how to walk upright. Their fingers, long and wrong, twitched as they dragged them across the wood. One of them crouched low, its face inches from the ground, staring at the cabin with unblinking hunger. Then, at the exact same time, they grinned. Jake grabbed my arm, yanking me away from the window. "We have to leave." I shook my head. "Number no. If we open that door..." He motioned toward the back. "The snowmobiles. If we run now..." A loud thud cut him off. Something heavy had landed on the roof. We heard it crawl, slow, careful, then a long, deep inhale. It was sniffing. A voice, just above us. "I smell you." Jake's grip on the axe tightened. My stomach twisted. I fought the urge to vomit. Then, silence. I held my breath. The cabin door creaked slightly, the wood groaning under pressure. The thing on the roof shifted, its weight pressing down. Then, in a perfect copy of Jake's voice, mocking, amused, "We have to leave." Jake's face went white. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door, my hands shaking. The wind picked up again, rattling the cabin walls. A deep growl reverberated through the air, low and guttural, making my skin crawl. Then, the fire went out. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Something slammed against the cabin. The walls shook. The whispers multiplied, overlapping, surrounding us. Then, everything stopped. The wind, the sounds, the movement, nothing but silence. And then, footsteps, walking away. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, an eternity. Then Jake exhaled shakily. "Are they gone?" I didn't answer. I moved toward the window slowly, terrified of what I might see. My fingers trembled as I pulled back the curtain just an inch. Snow, trees, empty clearing. Gone. Relief flooded my chest. I let out a shaky breath, my shoulders slumping. Then I saw them, standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still, waiting, grinning. They hadn't left. They were letting us think they had, waiting for us to step outside, waiting for us to run. And I swear to God, they were still whispering. Story number 8, buried alive. I woke up to silence, not the peaceful kind, the wrong kind, the kind that pressed against my ears, thick and unnatural. No wind, no crackling fire, just an eerie, suffocating stillness. Something was wrong. I sat up in my sleeping bag, reaching for my phone. Dead. That didn't make sense. It had been at 60% when I went to sleep. I turned toward Jake and Eric, still curled in their sleeping bags on the cabin floor, their breathing slow and steady. At least they were fine. I rubbed my arms, trying to shake off the creeping chill in my bones. The air inside felt heavy, wrong, too still, too dense. I turned toward the window and froze. It was gone. The window, the door, the walls. Everything was white. Snow. We were buried. Panic surged through me. I turned, shaking Jake awake. "Get up. Now." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Dude, what?" Then he saw it. His face went pale. Eric woke next, mumbling something about the cold before his gaze landed on the walls. He shot up, scrambling back against the floor. "What the hell?" I didn't have an answer. Jake lunged for the door, shoving his shoulder against it. It didn't budge. He tried again, harder. Nothing. "Help me!" Eric and I joined him, ramming our weight into the wood. It didn't even creak. It was like pushing against solid stone. The realization sank in like ice in my gut. We weren't trapped in a cabin. We were trapped in a tomb. My breathing came faster. No air. That was the real problem. If we were buried, how much oxygen did we have left? A few hours? Less. The cabin wasn't airtight, but it wasn't meant to be a coffin either. Eric grabbed the fire poker and swung at the window, aiming for where the glass had been. The metal clanged against ice. No crack, no dent, just a dull, muffled thud. It wasn't normal snow. It was packed. Solid. Jake cursed under his breath, rubbing his hands through his hair. This doesn't make sense. How does this happen overnight? I didn't have an answer. But then, I heard it. A sound. Software shuffling. Above us. My pulse slammed against my ribs. We all went still, listening. Another shift. A low, dragging scrape. Something moved outside. My stomach twisted. Did you hear that? Jake nodded slowly, his face tight. Eric swallowed hard. Maybe it's rescuers? I shook my head. No one knows we're out here. And even if they did, who shovels snow like that? The scraping sound returned. Closer this time. A long, slow drag right over the cabin roof. Then, knocking, not from the door, from above us. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the fire poker so hard my knuckles ached. Jake's breathing had gone shallow, his back pressed against the wall. 3 knocks. Then a pause. We were buried. Panic surged through me. I turned, shaking Jake awake. Get up. Now. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. Dude, what? Then he saw it. His face went pale. Eric woke next, mumbling something about the cold before his gaze landed on the walls. He shot up, scrambling back against the floor. What the hell? I didn't have an answer. Jake lunged for the door, shoving his shoulder against it. It didn't budge. He tried again, harder. Nothing. Help me! Eric and I joined him, ramming our weight into the wood. It didn't even creak. It was like pushing against solid stone. The realization sank in like ice in my gut. We weren't trapped in a cabin. We were trapped in a tomb. My breathing came faster. No air. That was the real problem. If we were buried, how much oxygen did we have left? A few hours? Less. The cabin wasn't airtight, but it wasn't meant to be a coffin either. Eric grabbed the fire poker and swung at the window, aiming for where the glass had been. The metal clanged against ice. No crack, no dent, just a dull, muffled thud. It wasn't normal snow. It was packed. Solid. Jake cursed under his breath, rubbing his hands through his hair. This doesn't make sense. How does this happen overnight? I didn't have an answer. But then, I heard it. A sound. Software shuffling. Above us. My pulse slammed against my ribs. We all went still, listening. Another shift. A low, dragging scrape. Something moved outside. My stomach twisted. Did you hear that? Jake nodded slowly, his face tight. Eric swallowed hard. Maybe it's rescuers? I shook my head. No one knows we're out here. And even if they did, who shovels snow like that? The scraping sound returned. Closer this time. A long, slow drag right over the cabin roof. Then, knocking, not from the door, from above us. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the fire poker so hard my knuckles ached. Jake's breathing had gone shallow, his back pressed against the wall. 3 knocks. Then a pause. Story number 9. The frozen train. The train tracks stretched endlessly into the snow-covered wilderness, half buried beneath fresh ice, untouched for decades. No stations, no signs, just steel rails vanishing into the white void. I never should have followed them. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a weekend in the mountains, to clear my mind. I had gone out for a short walk before sunset, but the storm rolled in faster than I expected. The wind howled through the trees, and soon the path back to the cabin had vanished under thick snowfall. I was lost. Then I found the tracks. They ran straight, slicing through the forest like an old scar, rusted, brittle with ice, but still there, still waiting. I followed them, hoping they'd lead somewhere. A road, a town, anything. But after an hour of walking, the air grew strange, heavier. The cold seemed deeper here, the silence too perfect. Even the wind had died. It was just me, my breath, fogging, in the freezing air, and the endless stretch of metal vanishing into the white haze. Then I heard it, a distant rumble. At first I thought it was thunder, but it was too steady, too rhythmic. A train. I froze. My mind struggled to make sense of it. These tracks were abandoned, had been for years. No working station for miles, no town to connect to. Yet, the sound grew louder. The ground shook. Ice cracked along the rails. And, through the blizzard, I saw them. Headlights, piercing through the white void, glowing too bright, too cold. A train, massive, blackened with time, racing straight toward me. I stumbled back, panic gripping my chest. It should have slowed, should have blown its horn, but it didn't. It tore through the storm, engines roaring, wheels screeching against frozen steel. And then I saw the windows. The passengers inside weren't normal. Their faces were twisted, locked in silent screams, hands pressed against the glass, eyes wide, bulging, staring right at me. Some were pale and frozen, others charred and broken. Their mouths moved, but no sound escaped. The train raced past me, a violent wind nearly knocking me off my feet. Snow and ice whipped at my face as the final car blurred past. Then, suddenly, silence. The train was gone. No fading echoes, no red taillights in the distance, just empty tracks stretching into the storm. I stood there, heart pounding, breath coming fast. The air felt wrong, thick with something unseen. Then, a whisper, software hollow, right behind me. Next departure, midnight. I spun, but there was no one there. Just endless snow. I needed to get out of there. I started running, following the tracks in the opposite direction. My boots crunched over the frozen ground, my breath sharp in the freezing air. But no matter how far I went, the landscape didn't change. No breaks in the trees, no sign of the cabin. Then I saw the footprints, not mine. Fresh ones leading alongside the tracks. But they didn't walk. They dragged, like something had crawled. I stopped cold. The wind picked up again, howling through the forest. My breath came in quick, short bursts as I followed the tracks with my eyes. And then I saw them. Figures, standing further down the line, not moving, not speaking, just watching me. They stood in the snow, tall and still, their outlines barely visible in the storm. No faces, just dark shapes against the endless white. Then, all at once, they started walking toward me. Slow at first, then faster. I turned and ran. The wind screamed around me. My boots slipped over ice. The storm grew thicker, the trees blurring. But I could hear them behind me, their footsteps crunching over the frozen ground. Then the rumble returned, louder this time, closer. I didn't dare look back. I ran, my lungs burning, the cold slicing at my skin. The sound of the train roared through the storm, but I couldn't see it, just the headlights glowing in the distance, growing brighter. Then, a whistle, long, sharp, echoing through the mountains, and suddenly, the ground vanished beneath me. I fell hard, snow swallowing me whole. I gasped for breath, coughing against the ice. The storm howled above me, but I couldn't see the sky. I was somewhere else. The world had shifted. The snow around me felt old. The air was stale. I looked up, my vision still spinning, and that's when I saw the platform, a train station buried beneath the ice. It stretched around me, walls covered in frost, old wooden benches half sunken into the snow. Faded signs hung above, words too worn to read. And just ahead, the train, waiting. The same blackened engine, the same frozen windows. The doors stood open, waiting for me. A single sign hung beside them, written in ice. Next departure, midnight. The whisper started again. Closer, behind me, I turned slowly, my entire body shaking. The figures stood at the edge of the platform now, no longer shadows. I could see their faces, or what was left of them. Passengers. Some frozen solid, skin blue and cracked, others burned, charred beyond recognition, some with gaping mouths, frozen in permanent screams, and their eyes, they were still moving, still watching me. A cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I didn't think. I ran. I sprinted toward the train, leaping onto the platform, stumbling through the open doors, just as the whistle screamed again. The second I crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut. The train shuddered. The passengers outside didn't move. They just watched as the wheels screeched against the ice, the engine roaring to life. And then they smiled as the train pulled away. I didn't know where it was taking me. I didn't know if it would ever stop. But I knew one thing. I had just boarded a train that should not exist. Story number 10. It wore my face. I woke up to the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting the ice outside the cabin, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate steps. Someone was walking outside. I sat up, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering shadows against the wooden walls. Jake and Daniel were still asleep, their slow, steady breathing the only sound inside. The footsteps stopped right outside the window. My stomach twisted. I turned my head slowly, peering through the frost-covered glass. The snow outside was untouched, smooth as glass beneath the moonlight. No footprints, no one there. A shiver crawled down my spine. Maybe I had imagined it. Just the exhaustion, the isolation getting to me. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tighter. The storm outside had died down, leaving an eerie, unnatural silence in its wake. Then, knocking. 3 slow, steady taps on the door. I shot up, my heart slamming against my ribs. Jake stirred beside me, mumbling something in his sleep. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to move. The floor was ice cold beneath my feet as I crept toward the door, each step heavy, deliberate. I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then a whisper right on the other side. Let me in. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. Mine. Panic surged through me, freezing me in place. The words had been too soft, almost teasing, but I had heard my own voice. Jake stirred awake, rubbing his eyes. What's going on? I barely managed to get the words out. Someone's outside. Daniel sat up now, his face groggy. What? Another knock. Louder this time. Jake frowned, getting to his feet. Dude, it's probably just an animal. But I could see it in his face. He didn't believe that either. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the window. He wiped away the frost with his sleeve and peered outside. His body went rigid. Guys? I didn't want to look, but I had to. I stepped forward, peering over his shoulder. Someone was standing at the edge of the clearing. A man. Tall still, almost too still. His head was tilted slightly, watching the cabin with a strange kind of patience. The flashlight beam flickered across his face, revealing something that sent ice straight through my veins. His face was mine, my jaw, my eyes, my nose. It was me. Daniel cursed under his breath, backing away from the window. The thing outside didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, its 2 wide grins stretching across my face like something that didn't belong. It took a step forward. I grabbed Jake's arm, my fingers digging into his skin. That's not me. His throat bobbed. Number, it's not. The fire crackled. The room suddenly felt too small, too enclosed. The thing outside took another step, and another. Then it started running, straight toward the cabin. I barely had time to react before Jake lunged for the door, slamming the lock shut just as something slammed against the wood. The entire cabin shook, a long, slow scrape of fingernails against the wood. Then, my voice again, mocking, amused. "Let me in." Daniel stumbled back, knocking over a chair. Jake grabbed the axe from the corner, his knuckles white. I pressed my back against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't human. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, the wrongness radiating from the other side of the door. Silence stretched between us. Then, knocking. From the window. Slow. Careful. I turned. Dread thick in my stomach. It was there, pressed against the glass. Grinning. The smile was wider now, too wide, stretching up toward its ears. Its teeth were too sharp. Its fingers, longer than mine. Wrong. Dragged slowly across the glass, leaving behind streaks of frost. It tilted its head, the way an animal does when it doesn't understand something. Then, in a perfect copy of my voice, "Why are you hiding?" Jake moved fast, grabbing the heavy curtain and yanking it shut. The moment the window was covered, the knocking stopped. The air in the cabin shifted, heavy, expectant. We waited. Minutes passed. Then Daniel whispered, "Is it gone?" I didn't know. Then, something creaked. The sound of wood bending. The sound of something crawling onto the roof. We all went rigid. Another creak. Closer now. Then a soft tap against the ceiling. "Let me in." My lungs refused to work. Jake clenched the axe tighter, his whole body trembling. The voice came again, curling down from above. A laugh. Then, scraping. It was moving, crawling down the walls. Daniel backed toward the fireplace, grabbing one of the iron pokers. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. Then, silence. The air felt wrong, like something was waiting. I reached for my phone with shaking hands, praying it would work. The screen lit up. My heart pounded as I checked the time, 3:12 a.m., and then a new notification. A picture. I hesitated before opening it, my hands slick with sweat. It was us, inside the cabin, taken from outside the window. My stomach dropped. Jake saw it, too. That's not possible. The picture was time-stamped. 3 minutes ago. Then, the whispers came back. But this time, they were inside the cabin. Story number 11. Don't eat the snow. We had been at the cabin for 2 days when Eric made the joke. We were standing outside, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes, turning everything into a vast, untouched sheet of white. It was beautiful in that eerie, silent way that only deep winter could be, the kind of quiet that made you feel like the world had been put on pause. Eric reached down, scooped a handful of snow, and grinned. You ever hear that thing about yellow snow? Jake rolled his eyes. Yeah, don't eat it, obviously. Eric smirked, tossing the snow in the air. Well, how about red snow? I laughed, shaking my head. What, like some horror movie thing? He shrugged. I don't know. Someone told me once, if you ever see red snow, don't eat it. Don't touch it. Just walk away. Jake snorted. Why? Eric hesitated, then shrugged. They wouldn't say. Just don't eat the red snow. That's all they'd tell me. I rolled my eyes and turned back toward the cabin. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That was before the snow actually turned red. That night, I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was the wind. The storm had picked up again, howling through the trees, rattling the window panes. But beneath it, something else. A soft, wet dripping. I sat up, blinking in the darkness. The fire had burned low, casting only weak shadows across the wooden walls. Jake and Eric were still asleep, buried under their blankets. Drip, drip, drip. The sound wasn't coming from inside, it was outside. I pulled on my jacket and boots, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit me like a wall, sharp and biting. Snow crunched under my feet as I moved toward the steps, raising the flashlight toward the clearing. And that's when I saw it, a wide stain spreading across the fresh snow. Dark, wet, red. My stomach twisted. I took a step closer, the beam of my flashlight flickering against the crimson ice. It wasn't paint. It wasn't food coloring. It was soaked in. Then I saw the footprints leading into the clearing, but none leading out. I swallowed hard, scanning the tree line. The storm had buried most of the tracks, but I could still make out the dragging marks, like something had been pulled or had crawled. A sharp wind cut through the trees, making the branches creak like old bones. I turned back toward the cabin, my heart hammering. Then, movement. The snow shifted. Right at the edge of the red stain, I stopped breathing. A shape lay in the snow, barely visible beneath the fresh powder. At first I thought it was a deer, maybe a bear, but then it twitched. My fingers tightened around the flashlight. Hello? Silence. Then it moved again, slowly, painfully, like it had been waiting for me to see it. The shape rose. My stomach clenched as it unfolded itself from the ground. It was wrong. A body, too thin, too long, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Its face, no, not a face. Just smooth, stretched skin, and its mouth, too wide. I took a step back, my pulse slamming in my ears. The thing swayed slightly, its head tilting, almost curious. Its fingers twitched, impossibly long, reaching toward me. Then, in a voice that wasn't mine, but tried to be, "Don't eat the snow." My blood turned to ice. It took a step forward. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, slamming the door behind me, locking it with shaking hands. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body numb from the cold. Jake sat up, groggily. "Dude, what?" I cut him off, my voice barely a whisper. "There's something outside." Eric groaned. "Seriously?" Again. I didn't answer, because I could still hear it. Outside the cabin. Close. A whisper. Software amused. "Don't eat the snow." Jake and Eric froze. Then, knocking. Not from the door. From every window. Jake grabbed the axe. Eric lunged for the fire poker. My hands clenched into fists. The whispers multiplied. "Don't eat the snow. Don't eat the snow. Don't eat the snow." Over and over, curling through the walls, seeping into the room like poison. The windows shattered, and I don't remember much after that, just running. The three of us tearing through the snow. The whispers chasing us. The wind howling. The storm blinding. The ground staining red beneath our feet. We didn't stop until we found the road, until we collapsed into the arms of strangers who didn't understand why we were screaming. When we returned the next morning with the search party, the cabin was gone. No broken windows, no tracks, just an endless stretch of white and a single patch of red. A warning, a reminder. Don't eat the snow. If you made it this far, you're officially braver than most. But tell me, have you ever experienced something unexplainable? A shadow where there shouldn't be one? A voice in the silence? Share your horror stories in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And if you enjoyed this terrifying journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. There are even more chilling stories waiting for you. Click on the videos appearing on your screen now. If you dare, stay safe, stay warm, and whatever you do, don't look behind you.